They took her on a Tuesday morning. The street was busy enough that no one noticed, or maybe they noticed and looked away. That happened a lot in this part of the city. A black van pulled up beside Ogana as she walked out of the market, and before she could reach for anything, two men grabbed her by the arms and pulled her in. The door slammed. The van moved. She didn't scream. That was the first thing that surprised them. The big one, the one with the scar across his chin, had expected crying, begging, maybe fighting. He'd done this enough times to know what fear looked like. But the woman sitting across from him in the back of the van wasn't afraid. She was watching him, quietly, the way a person watches a stranger on a train and already knows everything about them without saying a word. He didn't like it. Outside, the city moved on like nothing had happened. People bought bread. Taxis honked. Children ran across the road. Life continued, indifferent and loud. Inside the van, there was only silence, and the weight of it pressed against every man in that vehicle in a way none of them could explain. The big one leaned forward. "Relax," he said, though his voice came out less steady than he wanted. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Not yet." Ogana turned her eyes to him slowly. She held them there for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "You shouldn't have taken me." The van kept moving, but something in the air had already changed. The van drove for 20 minutes before anyone spoke again. Ogana didn't fill the silence. She sat with her hands resting in her lap, back straight, eyes moving slowly from one face to the next. The big one with the scar. The thin one near the door, who kept checking his phone. The nervous one in the front passenger seat, who hadn't looked back at her once. She memorized all of them. The scar's shape, the thin one's tattoo on his left hand, the way the nervous one spoke to the driver in short, clipped sentences that told her he was not the one giving orders. They weren't professionals. That was clear. Professionals didn't sweat like this. "She's not even scared," the thin one muttered, glancing at the scar-faced man as if he wanted confirmation that this was normal. "She will be," the big one replied. But he said it quickly, too quickly, like he was trying to convince himself. Ogana said nothing. She tracked the route. Left turn off the main road, then a long straight stretch, then gravel under the tires. Industrial area. Far enough from the city center that sound wouldn't carry. Close enough that someone had planned it with care. Whoever sent these men had done his homework. But he hadn't done enough of it. Because beneath the calm surface of Ogana's expression, a single thought moved with quiet, absolute certainty. Help was already coming. She had made sure of that before they ever put her in this van. She just had to buy herself a little time. That, she could do. The warehouse smelled of rust and old oil. They pulled her out of the van and pushed her through a side door. Rough concrete floor, a single bulb swinging from the ceiling, for walls that had seen better decades. 3 more men were waiting inside. Different from the van team. Older. Less nervous. One of them held a flashlight and swept it over her without a word. Then they searched her. They checked her jacket pockets, her shoes, her bag. They took her phone, cracked screen, cheap case, and set it on a table like it was evidence. They found nothing else. No weapons. No tracking device. No secondary phone. They were thorough, she had to admit. But they weren't thorough enough. The micro-tracker was sewn into the hem of her left sleeve. A device no wider than a coin, flat as paper, stitched in so cleanly that only someone who knew exactly where to look would ever find it. They didn't know. The moment they stopped searching and stepped back, the tracker had already done its job. A quiet signal, invisible, instant, had fired across the city and landed in one place, and one place only. 3 seconds after she crossed the threshold of that warehouse, someone else knew exactly where she was. Ogana sat down in the chair they pointed her to. She crossed her ankles. She folded her hands. And she waited. Somewhere across the city, in a room full of people who would never say a word out of place, a phone vibrated once on a glass table. And everything that came next began right there. 2 years earlier, Ogana had not been looking for love. She had been looking for answers. She worked as a legal investigator, quiet, unglamorous work that took her into courtrooms, corporate files, and occasionally into rooms where powerful men kept secrets they believed were safe. It was on one of those assignments that she first saw Ji-hoon. He was sitting across a conference table from 3 lawyers who were all pretending not to be afraid of him. He was the calmest person in the building. She filed her report. Then she went back, told herself it was for research. It wasn't. Ji-hoon noticed her the second time. He said nothing until she was about to leave. And then he said, very simply, "You're not from the firm, are you?" She told him the truth, which surprised both of them. What followed was not a romance story. There was no sweep of music, no accidental meeting in the rain. There were long conversations at odd hours, in places that weren't on any map. She asked direct questions. He gave direct answers. And when she understood fully who he was, what he ran, who answered to him, and what it cost people who crossed him, she made a choice. Not out of naivety, not out of recklessness, out of trust. The quiet, difficult kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind built slowly, in the dark, between two people who see each other clearly and stay anyway. She married him 11 months after they met. She had never once regretted it. The phone on the glass table belonged to a man named Kong Min-jun, Ji-hoon's head of operations, and the moment it vibrated, he picked it up, read the screen, and felt the temperature in his chest drop several degrees. He crossed the room in 3 steps and placed the phone face up in front of Ji-hoon without a single word. Ji-hoon looked at the notification. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he set the phone down. The men in the room had worked for Ji-hoon long enough to understand that his silence was not the same as stillness. It was the moment just before a decision. The fraction of a second when a man who has trained himself out of panic chooses his next move with the kind of precision that less disciplined men couldn't achieve on their best day. Someone in the room shifted his weight. Someone else cleared his throat. No one spoke. Ji-hoon straightened his jacket. He picked up his own phone, scrolled to a contact, and pressed dial. When the call connected, he spoke 4 words. She sent the signal. He paused. Let that land. Find them. All of them. He ended the call and looked up at the room. His expression had not changed. No rage, no fear, no drama. Just clarity. The specific clarity of a man who had already decided what was going to happen next and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Within 60 seconds, 12 phones across the city were ringing. The warehouse felt smaller now. Not because anything had changed physically. The same 4 walls. The same hanging bulb. The same smell of rust and old oil. But Ogana had been sitting in that chair for nearly an hour, and the kidnappers, who had started the evening with something close to confidence, were beginning to come apart at the edges. The big one crouched in front of her. He tried to look relaxed. He was not relaxed. Listen, he said. All you need to do is sit there. Nobody asks for trouble, and nobody gets hurt. Simple. Ogana looked at him steadily. I've already told you twice. Letting me go is the only thing that saves any of you. You're choosing not to listen. That's your decision. He stood up slowly. His jaw tightened. You think your husband is coming? He laughed, sharp, short, performed. You think he knows where you are? She said nothing. That silence landed harder than any answer would have. His jaw tightened further. He reached back and raised his hand. She moved before he finished the motion. Her right hand caught his wrist. Fast, precise, the kind of movement that comes from years of training, not instinct. She twisted. He yelped, yanked back, and stumbled into the man beside him. For 1 full second, no one moved. Then 3 of them rushed her at once. Numbers beat technique, and they forced her back into the chair. But her breathing stayed steady. Her eyes stayed clear. She wasn't scared. She was counting down. The youngest kidnapper was 19 years old, and he had been in the game less than 8 months. His name was Day One, though no one in the warehouse used names, and he had spent most of the evening trying not to make eye contact with the woman in the chair. There was something about her that he could not identify and did not want to think too hard about. She looked at everything like she was keeping score. It was nearly midnight when he drifted toward the small window near the back wall. He told himself he needed air. He told himself he was bored, restless, hungry. All of those things were probably true. But underneath them was something quieter, the kind of animal unease that lives below thought and reason. The feeling a body gets when it knows before the mind does that something is wrong. He looked through the dirty glass into the darkness outside. Nothing. Just the empty lot, the dead streetlight, the edge of the chain-link fence that ran along the perimeter. He almost turned away. And then he saw it, or thought he did. A shift in the shadows near the far fence line. Barely anything. The kind of movement you'd dismiss if you weren't already uneasy. He pressed his face closer to the glass. The shadow was gone. He exhaled. Told himself he was imagining things. Told himself there was nothing out there. But his hands, when he stepped back, were no longer steady. Outside, in the dark, 12 men held their positions and waited for the signal. The lights died at 12:14 a.m. One moment the warehouse was bathed in the weak yellow glow of the overhead bulb. The next, total darkness. And in that darkness, in the 1-second gap between the power cutting and the first flashlight snapping on, Ogana moved. She had been counting. Not the minutes, not the hours. The smaller things. The number of steps from the chair to where the youngest kidnapper stood. The angle of his body. The way he held his weapon. Loosely, low. The way someone holds something they've never had to use. She had memorized all of it in the light, so she could use it in the dark. For steps. She crossed them in silence. Her hand found his wrist before he understood what was happening. A technique she'd trained for years. Simple, efficient, designed to disarm without noise. The weapon transferred from his grip to hers in under 2 seconds. He didn't make a sound. He was too stunned. She stepped back, put the wall behind her, held the weapon low and still. When the first flashlight came on, it swept across the room and found the chair where Ogana had been sitting and found it empty. Someone shouted. Someone else swore. 3 flashlights crisscrossed the space in a panic. And then the doors came in. Not with a bang. With a precise, controlled force that said these men had done this many times before. Figures moved through the entrance, fast, coordinated, silent. Ogana pressed against the wall and let them work. She already had what she needed. It was not a rescue. That was the first thing any observer would have understood if they'd been there to see it. A rescue is messy. People shout. Things break. Someone always hesitates. This was nothing like that. Ji-hoon's men moved through the warehouse the way a blade moves through water, without drag, without wasted effort, without the slightest hesitation. Every man had a role and held it. Every angle was covered before it became a problem. The kidnappers had numbers. What they did not have was training. And against men who moved like this, numbers were a comfort, not an advantage. In less than 3 minutes, it was over. Some went down fighting. Some went down trying to run. One made it as far as the side door and found it already covered. There was no outburst of noise, no movie-style explosion of chaos. The whole operation played out in controlled, quiet violence that was somehow more frightening than anything loud would have been. When the last body hit the concrete floor, the warehouse was still again. One of Ji-hoon's men swept the room with a flashlight, counting, verifying. Another posted at the door. A third approached Ogana at the wall and gave a single, short nod. The way soldiers acknowledge one another, not the way bodyguards treat the people they protect. She nodded back. She lowered the weapon she was still holding and set it carefully on the ground beside her. Then she straightened her jacket, smoothed her sleeves, and waited for her husband. Ji-hoon came in last. He always did. Not out of caution alone, though caution was part of it, but because a man who enters a room before it is secured is a man who does not understand the value of patience. Ji-hoon had understood that lesson for a long time. He crossed the warehouse floor slowly, stepping around the still figures without looking down at them. His eyes went straight to Ogana. She was standing. That was the first thing he checked. Standing, jacket straight, expression composed. A bruise forming on her left cheekbone. A small cut on her wrist where the rope had bitten. Alive. Unhurt, in every way that mattered. He reached her and stopped. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was too much in the space between them to fit inside words. Relief that burned like anger, love that didn't soften for anyone watching. Fury held on a tight leash because this was not the moment to let it go. He reached out and took her face gently in both hands. Looked at her closely. Said nothing. Then he let his hands drop and reached behind her to undo the last of the rope still tied around her wrists. His movements were careful and unhurried, as though the rest of the warehouse did not exist. When she was free, she looked up at him. One of them is still breathing, she said quietly. Ji-hoon turned. Across the room, a man lay slumped against the wall, beaten, barely conscious, but alive. Ji-hoon walked toward him. The man's name, he would eventually say, was Ri. But not yet. At first he said nothing. He pressed himself harder against the wall as Ji-hoon crouched in front of him, as if the extra distance could help him. It could not. Ji-hoon was not the kind of man whose reach was limited by space. He waited. That was the thing about Ji-hoon that men like Ri had never understood until it was too late. He did not need to shout. He did not need to threaten. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. The silence, combined with the fact that every single other person who had been in this warehouse was now on the floor, did more work than any raised voice could have managed. Ri broke in under 4 minutes. I don't know everything, he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Tell me what you know, Ji-hoon replied. We were hired 3 days ago. The job was, take her. Don't touch her. Hold her. Wait for contact. He swallowed hard. We were told you'd come for her. That was the whole point. Getting you to come was the point. Ji-hoon went very still. Who hired you, he said. Ri hesitated. Ji-hoon waited. Beck, Ri finally said. Almost a whisper. Beck, June. The walls didn't shake. The room didn't change. But something shifted, quietly and completely, in the air, the way pressure changes before a storm that has already decided to arrive. Ji-hoon stood slowly. He didn't say the name out loud again. He didn't need to. The name itself sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripple moved outward before anyone spoke, before anyone moved. Kong Min-jun, who had followed his employer into the warehouse and stood now by the door, closed his eyes briefly. That was the only reaction he allowed himself. Ogana had heard the name from across the room. She walked over. You know who that is, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Ji-hoon said. This wasn't random. No. She looked at him. He wanted you to come out. He wanted me to react, Ji-hoon said quietly. To come out angry. Visible. Loud. He wanted to see how I move when I'm not thinking clearly. He paused. This wasn't the attack. This was the test. Ogana let that sit for a moment. The kidnapping, the van, the warehouse, the ropes, all of it, had not been about hurting her. It had been about reading Ji-hoon. Baek Jun had pulled the one thread he knew Ji-hoon couldn't ignore, and then watched to see what unraveled. It was smart. She had to admit that. Cold, calculated, and precise. The kind of move that only someone deeply familiar with Ji-hoon's thinking could have designed. He knows you well, she said. He used to, Ji-hoon replied. Something in his voice was not anger. It was older than anger. And colder. We need to go, he said. We have a lot of work to do. Baek Jun was not the kind of man who celebrated too early. He was 51 years old, and he had survived in this business for 3 decades by learning the difference between a plan working and a plan succeeding. Plans working was easy. Plans succeeding required patience. He watched vehicle movements on city cameras he'd had access to for years, nothing direct, nothing incriminating, and allowed himself only the quietest satisfaction. Ji-hoon had come out. Exactly as predicted. He and Ji-hoon had once operated together. Not as equals. Beck had been older, more established, but as partners within the same network, dividing the city the way civilized men divide a meal. That arrangement had held for years. And then Ji-hoon had grown. Quietly. Consistently. In the specific, dangerous way that men who are smarter than everyone else tend to grow. Until one day Beck had looked up and realized that what had once been a partnership now looked, from the outside, like 2 very unequal halves. He had suggested restructuring. Ji-hoon had declined, politely. The peace that followed was not peace. It was 2 men pretending. Now Beck was done pretending. He had spent 6 months weakening Ji-hoon from the edges, quietly, invisibly, without ever touching the center. What he needed now was Ji-hoon out in the open. Emotional. Reactive. Making the kind of mistakes that visible men make. The woman was supposed to bring him out. He closed the tablet. She had. Now the real work could begin. Back at the house, Ogana sat across from Ji-hoon and Min-jun at the long dining table that had become, on nights like this, a war room. She did not begin with how she felt. She began with what she knew. There were 7 of them in total, 4 in the van, 3 already at the warehouse. She spoke steadily, the way she always did when her mind was working and her emotions were set aside. Van team. The lead is a man with a long scar on his chin, approximately 40 years old. Mandarin speaking, but not native. Mixed tones, probably grew up speaking something else first. The thin one with the left-hand tattoo took orders from someone by phone twice during the drive. The nervous one in the passenger seat is the weak link. He checked his watch 14 times. Min-jun was writing. At the warehouse, the phone call man switched languages when his contact called. He used a phrase I've heard before, a coded check-in that Baek Jun's network used 3 years ago. She paused. I did work adjacent to that network before I met Ji-hoon. I recognized it. Ji-hoon looked at her steadily. The shift change at the warehouse was every 2 hours, she continued. Which means there's a second team scheduled to arrive at 2 a.m. A team that doesn't know the first team is gone. The table went quiet. Ji-hoon leaned forward. How long do we have? Ogana glanced at the clock on the wall. 43 minutes. They moved fast. Within 20 minutes, 3 of Ji-hoon's men were positioned near the warehouse to intercept the second team, quietly, without incident, with orders to detain, not destroy. Ji-hoon wanted information, not bodies. While that was arranged, Min-jun laid Ogana's intel beside everything they already had on Baek-jun, and the picture that formed was not a comfort. Baek had been working for 6 months, maybe longer. Informants inside Ji-hoon's trade routes had been quietly flipped. 3 supply contacts had rerouted shipments over the past quarter, moving product away from Ji-hoon's channels and into Baek's without a single visible flag. 2 safe house locations had been compromised. They simply hadn't known it yet. The kidnapping had made sense as a provocation. Now it made even more sense as a distraction. While Ji-hoon was supposed to be reacting, burning with visible anger, making the kind of moves that emotional men make, Baek's real plan had been running in the background. Quiet, systematic, designed to drain resources and alliances while attention was pointed the wrong way. He expected you to be loud, Ogana said. Ji-hoon said nothing. He built his entire plan around you being loud, she continued. Everything he's done in the last 6 months assumed that when you found out, really found out, you'd come at him directly. Visibly. He's prepared for that. She looked at him across the table. So we won't give it to him. Ji-hoon looked back. For the first time all night, something close to a smile crossed his face. For the next 4 days, Ji-hoon was invisible. No public movement. No obvious gathering of men. No signals that any observer, and Baek-jun was certainly observing, could read as preparation for retaliation. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that looks like grief or shock, or the stunned stillness of a man who doesn't yet know what to do next. Baek-jun, watching from a distance, saw exactly what he expected to see. Ji-hoon, working in the dark, was something else entirely. On the second night, one of Baek's known safe houses, a unit in a gray apartment block on the eastern edge of the city, was entered, swept, and cleared. The men inside were not there when it happened. The ledgers were. The communication equipment was. The list of names and coded contacts that Baek had kept locked in a waterproof case under the floor was not there when he sent someone to check on day 3. On the third night, a second location was treated the same way. No violence. No noise. No message left behind. Ji-hoon took what was useful and left everything else untouched, a decision designed to delay the moment Baek understood what was happening. By the time Baek realized his safe houses had been visited, he'd already lost 2 communication networks, 1 weapons cache, and a full map of his financial contacts. He hadn't lost them loudly. He hadn't even lost them in a way he could point to and call an attack. Ji-hoon had simply reached into Baek's operation and removed things. Like a surgeon. Like a man who was not reacting. Like a man who was in control. The betrayal came from a name no one expected. His name was Sung-won, and he had been with Ji-hoon for 11 years. He had eaten at that same dining room table. He had stood outside the hospital when Ogana had been ill 2 winters ago. He had been, by any measure, part of the inner circle that Ji-hoon trusted without thinking about it, because some people you trust for so long that trust becomes invisible, which was exactly what Baek-jun had counted on. It was Ogana who found it. She had been quietly cross-referencing the coded contacts from Baek's recovered ledger against the timing of certain incidents over the past 6 months. A shipment that went wrong. A meeting that was leaked. A contact who went silent at a very specific moment. She brought the pattern to Ji-hoon at 11 in the evening without preamble. He looked at the timeline she had built. He looked at it for a long time. Sung-won, he said. Yes, she said. He said nothing else for a while. Sung-won was the reason Baek had known Ogana's route on the morning of the kidnapping. He was the reason 3 of Ji-hoon's outer contacts had been turned without a single warning sign. He was the thread that had been quietly unraveling things from the inside, for long enough that the damage ran deeper than anyone had wanted to believe. Ji-hoon exhaled once. Slowly. Then he called Min-jun. There were no more invisible enemies inside. Not anymore. Ogana found Ji-hoon standing at the window at 2 in the morning. She knew what he was planning. She had spent enough years beside him to read his stillness, the particular kind that came before a direct move. He was going to go after Baek Jun openly, hit him hard, fast, and let the results speak for itself. She understood the instinct. She also knew why it was wrong. He's expecting it, she said. Ji-hoon didn't turn from the window. I know. Everything he's done has been to get you moving in a straight line toward him. He's positioned for that. Whatever you're planning to do directly, he's already planned what comes after. A pause. So what would you do, he said. She sat down at the table and pulled a notepad toward her. Baek needs to believe he has the advantage, she said. If he feels threatened, he goes quiet and waits. But if he feels like he's winning, if you give him a signal that looks like desperation, he'll come out to finish it. She started writing. We feed him something. A meeting location. A name. Something that looks like you're trying to reach a neutral party to broker peace. Something that says you're scared. Ji-hoon finally turned from the window. He'll suspect a trap, he said. Maybe. But his arrogance won't let him walk away from it. She looked up. He spent 6 months convincing himself he's the smartest person in this city. That doesn't just turn off. Ji-hoon picked up the pen she was holding out. Together, they started writing. 3 nights later, the trap was set. The location was a warehouse on the north side of the city, one that Baek's intelligence would confirm was tied to a neutral broker, a man who had worked with both sides over the years. The message fed through someone's compromised channel was carefully worded. Ji-hoon wanted a conversation, not a fight. A way out. Baek Jun had his people verify the location twice. He confirmed the broker connection. He spent 2 full days watching the building from a distance. And then, because he was exactly the kind of man Ogana had said he was, he came. He didn't come personally, not yet. He sent 20 men first, arranged to circle the building before he arrived. Ji-hoon had expected that. His team was already positioned further out, controlling every exit before the first of Baek's men reached the gate. For 7 minutes, the plan was perfect. Then a communication delay, a signal that bounced 30 seconds later than it should have, reached Baek's lead enforcer just early enough. The enforcer shifted position. He moved left instead of right. And in that shift, he came face to face with Park Dae-young, Ji-hoon's most trusted lieutenant, 11 years at his side, 1 second before the net was supposed to close. The shot was fired. Park went down hard. He was breathing when they reached him, but barely. Ji-hoon stayed in the field until the operation concluded. He gave no unnecessary orders. His face gave nothing away. But when he finally knelt beside Park, something behind his eyes broke. Quietly, completely, and without any witness except Ogana. Baek Jun ran for 6 days. He was good at disappearing. He had built a career on knowing when to vanish and where to go. But Ji-hoon was no longer running after him. He was already where Baek was going to end up, a distinction that took Baek far too long to understand. On the 7th day, in the back room of a restaurant that Baek had believed was one of his last safe contacts, he found Ji-hoon sitting at a table. Calm, jacket straight, 2 men at the door and 2 at the window, but they could have been furniture for all the noise they made. Ogana sat beside Ji-hoon, not behind him, not at a distance. Beside him, Baek tried, briefly, to negotiate. He cited old history, mutual benefit, things they had once shared. He offered information, names, contacts, territory. His voice, for the first time in 3 decades, carried something very close to fear. Ogana opened a folder on the table and slid it across without a word. Inside was everything. The payments to Sungwon, the compromised routes, the order that had sent 7 men to pull her off the street on a Tuesday morning. Every thread, every name, every transaction, documented, dated, and already in the hands of 3 people who were not in that room. Baek looked at it. Then he looked up at Ji-hoon. There was nothing left to offer, nothing left to threaten. Every move he might have made had already been anticipated and removed. Ji-hoon leaned forward. You didn't start a fight, he said quietly. You started your end. Baek Jun had no answer. Outside, the city moved on.